4020.
Straight from. I was going to say the horse's mouth, but that sounds derogatory.
So yes, I was asked to join the board on the basis that clearly the board had basically departed, and they have to have a board.
Yep.
As a governing body of the sport,
that's a good idea. Yeah.
Well, especially if, for example, a coach makes an allegation, somebody at the governing body has to answer that.
So obviously they were, rather than a full recruitment process on the basis that it was an interim board that would only run till July, looking at people that would have necessary skills and attributes to join a board, and they got to the bottom of the list and found me.
Well, they may have found you on another board that could transfer their skills across.
Yeah, look, as an ex-RFL employee and somebody that clearly understands the sport, I think one of the criticisms of the previous board, rightly or wrongly from the clubs, was that there were a number of people on there that weren't from rugby league background. So I think they were trying to find some representation that fitted that. Yes, on the inclusion board, former RFL employee, and ultimately I would say, a neutral as they come as a referee.
Did they want that?
It seems not.
So how long were you on the board for?
Didn't really get going. No. So I was.
You were named.
No, I was elected to the board, and the press release went out. But within probably less than a week, I received a phone call from Tony Sutton to basically say,
you've done a great job.
Unless you plus one other resigns, the whole board will go under. And the clubs will veto the whole board again, and it will collapse.
Which I would have taken as a badge of honour.
So I have taken it in some respects. I think, the people that have gone on to the board are effectively those on the working party already, working with Nigel on the review of the sport. So there's a logic to the people on there. I think my comment back to that, however, would be, if there's a working party that's reviewing the sport to produce a proposed outcome, who is checking and challenging that process?
The chair of the RFL.
Well, one of the reasons why
there isn't a chair of the RFL.
So on the resolutions with the club, the resolutions of the club basically said that they obviously they wanted Simon to go, didn't they? They wanted, I suppose, effectively, they don't necessarily want a new board, but it's created a vacuum where a new board had to be appointed. And they didn't want new board appointments to be made until the outcome of the working party. Not realising that Nigel couldn't be chair.
Which I think was the assumption.
Which was the assumption, yes. And that shows, I think, naivety.
But also, this outcome will still need to be voted on.
It will be.
And ratified.
Absolutely.
So,
but I think you could say that they clearly got.
So
the
you need a
support of
board.
the clubs.
You need an independent board.
You do.
To ratify the report.
And ultimately the sport gets a huge amount of funding through Sport England, and as part of the requirements for all that, you have to have an independent board.
It's not the sport; it's actually the RFL, isn't it, that gets that funding?
Yes, the governing body.
So some of it's channeled through the foundations of clubs, but it's actually money that keeps the RFL going.
And there's a proportion of staff at the RFL that are funded through that money, and they support an important role in the game from top to bottom, really. So there were a couple of things. Nigel couldn't be chair; they didn't realise that. Meant an RFL member needed to be chair, which meant they would have lost control of that board. They then needed control of the board by putting their own people on the board, and there's a limit to the number of people you can have on a board, which meant that they had to lose two people that weren't seen to be, this is my interpretation, controllable.
Non-club appointees.
Controllable by those individuals.
But it also means we've lost our seat on the international board at the moment.
Have we?
Because
I thought you meant our seat as a podcast on the board.
No, there isn't a chair of the RFL to step into the position that is left for the chair of the RFL.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure who is chair at the moment.
Well, according to the website, there isn't a chair.
Right.
There is only one board member and two observer members. But we do know that...
But that's not true, because...
No, because a missive went out to the community game this week.
Yes, I'll read that in a bit.
Which is a very important one about respect for officials, which was delivered and signed by Martin Coyd.
Our friend.
Yes, who was on the board.
Who supposedly is on the board, but hasn't formally been... Well, he was announced. Yeah.
He might be in charge.
The board is as it was announced, except me. and accept. I think is it Dermot Power? Is it?
Yes.
Why have they picked on
think-
you?
I'm going to need
So
tissues.
Dermot's from ING, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's
me.
bullying.
So basically, they got rid of the independents.
Well, I don't know. Is IMG considered to be an independent? I mean, they've got vested interest in the game, the consultants, etc. Yeah. Look, I don't know the ins and outs, and the people that have gone on there. This is no slight to the people that have gone on there. They're vastly experienced people. I think my concern, however, was that if you've got a working party reviewing the sport, proposing an outcome, the RFL's board is not a functioning board as I see it, in its true sense of its existence to check and challenge a process, and that's why you have a board, because I can't remember all the names now, but Lord Kane, is it? Emma Rosewarne, and I can't remember who the other one that's come from the working parties now on the RFL board, which hasn't been announced, but that is the makeup of the board. So I joined one board meeting, at which it was like attending my own funeral actually. Cause
Was there a nice eulogy?
no, it was basically James and Dermot are stepping down from the board, and this is the situation.
Whether they like it or not.
What I did find interesting though, it was a hastily arranged meeting, and it was a virtual meeting, so there were only a number of people that could attend, and only a certain number of people on camera. But some of those leading voices that you'd have expected to be on camera and speaking didn't speak, which I found enlightening. I don't know. I think
Just checking if you're still on the board.
Oh, on the website. I don't think I was ever put on the board on the website. So that announcement, that press release should have gone out 3-4 weeks ago about my stepping down from the board, and wasn't for some reason.
Still only officially 3 members of the RFL
Yeah,
board
and that's
on
not
their
right
website.
though. That's not right. But
2 of whom are observers,
yes,
and 1 of whom is the CEO.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like the game is in a mess, if I'm honest.
I don't think you're alone.
I think it's in abeyance is probably a better way of putting it. I think a lot of people in the sport feel like they're on hold.
We were saying last week that the concern is announcements are being made, but how do you know that come July, who should be making those announcements and what authority they've got to do that? So we're already talking about there's going to be a magic weekend next year, and it's going to be in Newcastle. There's going to be potentially 1, maybe 2 World Club Challenges. There's going to be Las Vegas is going to be announced on Wednesday. Now all of that is independent of a concerted board that is making a strategic plan for the sport. Now they may well be going, yep, that's fine, keep Las Vegas in there. But it just seems that anybody can say anything at the moment.
Yeah, well, the board doesn't have a voice, does it? And I think this has been one of the criticisms of the
strategic
RFL
review
generally,
doesn't have a
anyway.
voice,
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
And again, do we know what its terms and conditions are? Do we know in what what its brief is? What can it change? Do we know if it's going to be presented to the Rugby League Council, but is effectively endorsed by that Rugby League Council? It's like,
who knows?
That's the abeyance bit.
I don't know. As I say, I only went to one board meeting there, and there wasn't much discussed in there of any of that. It was more about the makeup of the board and the structure and stuff like that, because it's had to be hastily put together because of the situation that came about with Simon's departure and then the board's departure. That's not something that happens day in, day out. They had to find a new board pretty quickly to fill that gap, and then there's going to be a new board appointed anyway off the back of the review anyway. So,
but if Steve McNamara's got to stand outside the headmaster's office this week, who's the headmaster?
Well, Tony Sutton's CEO, isn't he? Ultimately, but
ultimately, it would normally be the board, wouldn't it?
I don't know really. I don't think it is, to be honest. I think in those situations there's a disciplinary process, and it goes through that process. It would be a situation like that is normally handed over to an investigator. The investigator investigates it, speaks to relevant parties, and submits a report back through the usual disciplinary process. So things like that don't, in my opinion, go to the board. It just follows a process.
If there was a major issue within the sport,
well, there is a board, and people on that board would discuss it and determine things. But I don't know. I have no idea what's happening in terms of the working party. You'll probably know far more than me around, our club's being interviewed, our players being interviewed.
I believe Mr. Wood might be seeing Wigan and Warrington this week.
Well, what are they up to?
Well, I think taking soundings.
But when
And he's
you
certainly
do
been-
a whole
he's been
game
in a lot
review,
of
do you
games,
not?
Yeah,
Certainly a whole
but how
game.
do you do a whole game review in 3 months?
Yeah, I know. Well, to me...
But anyway, you're back, and that's the good thing.
to me, it hasn't changed my view, and that was my view going into it, with my eyes wide open, which was... It feels from the outside looking in that this feels like a fait accompli. That was my concern, which I raised. And the only reason I accepted it was, not that I have the time necessarily to do it, so it's probably worked out quite well, actually, was more that I didn't want it to be a fait accompli, and I could... you're better inside than outside, trying to influence. And I felt I would have been potentially able to do that and voice an opinion that is a neutral opinion without any vested interest at all, other than for the benefit of the game. So we'll see. I've got my impressions of what that outcome will be. I suspect we'll end up at 14 teams.
Which is, again, interesting because...
Does that include 2 French teams?
Well, no, but on the horizon is a potential NRL model that has only 10 teams.
Yeah, well...
So again, who's making the decision on that?
Who knows? I don't think anybody really knows what's going on with the NRL, do they? I think it's more likely you'll go to 14 teams with the likes of Salford going, because they've pretty much gone.
But the interesting thing about 14 teams is one of the things that is being discussed, apparently, is... Whilst we quite like what the IMG grading does, we don't quite like it if the team in the championship that finishes top can't get promoted, which could very well be to lose the way things are going.
But imagine if it was a team
and they are
with
the next
B.
team in grading as well. So all of this, we want 14 teams, but we don't know who's not happy about having French teams in, but we can maybe tolerate one, but we don't want 2. And you end up with 2. And the other thing is, I think had Catalan won on Saturday, which, to be fair, they only looked like they might do for 2 minutes in the first half, you would have actually seen the members of the RFL board spontaneously combust that.
All 3 of them.
Well, they've been there before. They've been to the grand final before.
And
The world
last
doesn't end, does it?
No, but they wanted to impose a £500,000 bond on them.
Yeah.
If they'd got there this time, then with everything being in abeyance and talk of the value of French teams and all that kind of thing, I think some ashen-faced people would have probably been reduced to a pile of...
You didn't even get the chance to get hospitality, which Kevin Nicholas was moaning that the previous board hadn't taken up, or
Hadn't
pies and
taken
stuff.
up.
No, he was moaning because the previous directors hadn't been to games and stuff.
Okay.
Because that's an important facet of being a director of a sport, is free hospitality
Right.
and stuff.
As long as it's pie and peas.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it was pie and peas, was it, that was served?
The good news is the RFL board's broken, but I've fixed the LED board. So,
How many points does this qualify?
that must be a
think
1
we're
and a
in
quarter.
Super
now.
League next year.
I was impressed, I must admit, last
But,
week.
I mean, we're slightly below James Graham's podcast, but all the other ones they don't.
If this doesn't attract people in Mexico, I don't know what will.
Well, I know. Big in Mexico. Still, we are the number 1 rugby league podcast in Mexico.